Christopher Nolan's The Dark Knight 2008 is often regarded as one of the greatest superhero films of all time. It's dark, gritty, and explores profound themes about morality, chaos, and the consequences of our actions. While the film is widely praised for its writing, direction, and especially Heath Ledger's iconic performance as the Joker, there's one scene in the movie that doesn't quite hold up when examined closely: the boat scene. In this pivotal moment, the Joker places two boats, one filled with innocent civilians and the other filled with criminals, out on the water, each with a bomb rigged to the other boat. The catch is that the boats hold the detonator for the bomb on the other boat, and the Joker gives the passengers on both boats a choice. Either they can blow up the other boat, or they can be blown up themselves. The Joker's logic is twisted, suggesting that people will either give in to chaos, or on the other hand, that humans have an inherent decency that will triumph in the end. That people are willing to kill others in order to survive. Ultimately, the movie ends with both boats surviving. Neither group presses the button to blow up the other boat, and the passengers on both vessels show restraint, symbolizing Batman's belief that people, at their core, can be trusted to make the right choice. The boat scene is presented as a moment of hope, where individuals reject the Joker's cynical view of humanity. But when we take a step back and think about it more critically, the way this situation plays out seems wildly unrealistic. First, let's revisit what exactly happens in the scene. The Joker's plan is to force the people on the two boats, one carrying citizens and the other carrying convicts, to make a life-or-death decision: either blow up the other boat or wait for their own boat to explode at midnight. It's a test of humanity, with the Joker claiming that people will always choose self-preservation over morality, but that deep down, everyone is as ugly as he is. The people on the civilian boat are ordinary citizens, while the criminals have been rounded up and placed on the other boat. As the tension builds, it becomes clear that the stakes are high. The two boats are in a standoff. The Joker sets the timer, and the people on both boats are told that if neither boat blows up the other by midnight, both boats will be destroyed. What follows is a dramatic, nail-biting race against time. However, the outcome is hard to swallow. Both boats remain intact. The citizens of the civilian boat do not press the button to blow up the criminals, and vice versa. In the end, the timer runs out, and the boats do not explode, largely because the people on board refuse to succumb to the Joker's nihilistic view of humanity. Let's take a moment to consider the psychology behind the choices these people would have to make in this situation. The Dark Knight relies heavily on the assumption that the people on the boats will rise above their baser instincts, and instead of succumbing to fear and self-preservation, they will show restraint and trust one another. Humans, when faced with imminent life-or-death situations, often default to the primal instinct of survival. We are biologically wired to protect ourselves, and in high-stakes situations like the one presented in the boat scene, our first instinct is often self-preservation, even at the expense of others. In a scenario where every individual is given the option to save themselves by pressing a button that will kill strangers, it's almost impossible to imagine that most people would resist the urge to save their own lives. Let's be real. If you were on that civilian boat, looking at a criminal who may or may not have a violent past, and you had the chance to destroy that boat in order to guarantee your survival, would you really hesitate? Sure, some people might feel conflicted, but history, psychology, and countless studies of human behavior show that in life-threatening situations, people often make decisions based on self-interest. Consider what the Joker was banking on. He wanted to expose the true nature of humanity, that we are all willing to betray each other when survival is at stake. It's a cruel but ultimately accurate view. The Joker's entire scheme is predicated on a near-universal trait: fear. Fear drives humans to do horrific things, to make decisions that can destroy the moral fabric of their society. In his mind, even the supposedly good people on the civilian boat would inevitably turn on the criminals. He was confident that human nature would lead them to make the logical choice: kill the other group to save themselves. So how realistic is it that both boats would choose not to blow up the other? The answer, unfortunately, is not very. There is a disturbing lack of understanding in the movie's presentation of human nature. It's incredibly optimistic for a film that prides itself on presenting a gritty, morally complex world. The situation on the criminal's boat is equally problematic. We are led to believe that these hardened criminals, many of whom have been incarcerated for violent crimes, would show the same kind of restraint as the innocent civilians. Yet, when faced with the prospect of freedom, it's difficult to believe that these men wouldn't make the same choice as the civilians. It's easy to imagine that someone on that boat would press the button without hesitation, motivated by fear, desperation, and a desire to save their own skin. The Joker's plan was cruel, but it was also based on something more deeply cynical. He knew that people are rarely as noble as they would like to think. The criminals on the boat might be hardened, but that doesn't necessarily mean they would sacrifice themselves for someone else. Criminals, like anyone else, are driven by a sense of survival. Many would probably see it as an opportunity to secure their freedom, even if it meant betraying others. The Joker was playing on that exact psychological principle. People are not inherently good. The film suggests that everyone is capable of goodness, but the reality is that the pressure of the situation would most likely make the criminals hit the button to save themselves, just as the civilians might. The boat scene also suffers from a certain kind of forced symbolism. Nolan tries to create a moral high ground where both groups demonstrate faith in each other and decide not to act out of fear. But that kind of moral clarity feels almost forced and overly idealistic. The Joker's philosophy was that chaos and the human willingness to destroy others for their own benefit would eventually prevail. The fact that this didn't happen, both boats surviving the ordeal, feels like the filmmakers wanted to inject an unrealistically hopeful message into the narrative. But in the real world, people would not just decide not to press the button. There would likely be an overwhelming sense of panic and distrust. The Joker's design was meant to escalate fear to the point where people couldn't think clearly enough to act morally, and under extreme duress, that's usually what happens. It's easy to say, in hindsight, that you would hold back from such a choice, but when your life is on the line, and you're in an environment where life and death decisions are made in seconds, the decision becomes less about philosophy and more about survival. Ultimately, the boat scene in The Dark Knight presents a somewhat false sense of optimism about human nature. It's designed to show that, deep down, people will do the right thing, that they are capable of self-restraint and moral fortitude when faced with life or death decisions. While this is a nice message, it doesn't really hold up under scrutiny. The reality of human behavior under extreme pressure is much more complicated and, more often than not, less idealistic. People in high-stress situations tend to act impulsively, and they often do so to protect themselves, not to preserve the lives of others. Had one of the boats exploded, it would have been a much darker and more realistic reflection of human nature. In many ways, that would have made the Joker's plan seem all the more tragic and insightful. But by choosing to let the boats survive, The Dark Knight sacrifices realism for a message of hope that doesn't quite align with the brutal world it has otherwise depicted. While The Dark Knight is undoubtedly a masterpiece in many ways, the boat scene is one of its weaker moments. The idea that both groups of people, civilians and criminals alike, would choose not to blow each other up, despite the overwhelming fear and desperation that would naturally arise in such a scenario, is far-fetched. In reality, self-preservation would likely win out, and the boats would have exploded. The film's optimistic conclusion feels out of place in a world that has been shown to be full of corruption, chaos, and moral ambiguity. Christopher Nolan's film presents a grand vision of human decency prevailing against a nihilistic worldview, but in doing so, it sacrifices the complexity of human behavior under pressure. It's a beautiful idea, but ultimately unrealistic. The boat scene, for all its tension and drama, ends on a note of hope that doesn't feel earned, and that's what makes it one of the least believable moments in an otherwise brilliant movie.